Imagine being lost in the world's largest hot desert with temperatures reaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit, forced to drink bat blood in your own urine to survive. Imagine reaching such depths of despair that you attempt suicide by slitting your wrists, only to discover that your blood is so dehydrated it immediately clots, saving your life against your will. This is not a horror movie or a fictional survival tale. This is the shocking true story of Mauro Prosperi, a former Olympic pentathlete, an Italian police officer who became lost in the Sahara Desert for 9 days and survived by doing things that would break most people's minds and spirits. His ordeal pushed the boundaries of human endurance so far that it redefined what survival means when civilization disappears, and you become a predator fighting for every breath. Could you drink bat blood to stay alive? Could you find the will to live when death seems like mercy? Stay with us, because what Mauro endured in the Sahara will challenge everything you think you know about the human capacity for survival. In the sophisticated world of international athletics and Italian law enforcement, Mauro Prosperi represented the pinnacle of human physical and mental achievement. As a former Olympic pentathlete who had competed at the highest levels of international sport, he possessed the kind of conditioning, mental toughness, and competitive drive that separated elite athletes from ordinary mortals. His transition from Olympic competition to a career as a police officer had given him additional skills in crisis management, survival techniques, and maintaining composure under extreme pressure. Born in Sicily in 1955, Mauro had grown up in a culture that valued physical courage, mental resilience, and the ability to endure hardship without complaint. His athletic career had taken him around the world, competing in the pentathlon's 5 demanding disciplines: fencing, swimming, equestrian show, jumping, pistol shooting, and cross-country running. The pentathlon was designed to test the complete athlete, requiring not just physical excellence, but the mental versatility to master completely different skills and perform under intense pressure. By 1994, at the age of 39, Mauro was looking for new challenges that could replace the competitive highs he had experienced as an Olympic athlete. Police work provided intellectual stimulation and public service, but it couldn't replicate the physical and psychological demands that had defined his identity for decades. Like many former elite athletes, he struggled with the transition from a life organized around peak performance to the more mundane rhythms of civilian career and family responsibilities. The Marathon des Sables represented exactly the kind of challenge Mauro craved. Billed as the toughest foot race on earth, this 254-kilometer ultra-marathon across the Moroccan Sahara attracted extreme athletes from around the world who were seeking the ultimate test of endurance, navigation, and mental toughness. Competitors were required to carry all their own food and equipment for 6 days of racing across some of the most hostile terrain on the planet, with only water provided at checkpoints. Mauro's preparation for the race was meticulous and professional. He spent months conditioning his body for the extreme heat, practicing with the exact equipment he would carry, and studying navigation techniques that would be crucial for success in the trackless expanses of the Sahara. His background as a pentathlete had given him experience with the kind of multidisciplinary preparation required for such an extreme challenge. The 1994 Marathon des Sables attracted 133 competitors from 27 countries, representing some of the world's most experienced ultramarathon runners and adventure racers. The field included desert veterans who had completed the race multiple times, military personnel with survival training, and extreme sports enthusiasts who had tested themselves in the world's most challenging environments. Mauro felt confident and well prepared as the race began on April 10, 1994. The first 3 stages progressed normally, with Mauro performing competitively and managing the harsh desert conditions with the skill expected from his athletic background. The Sahara was revealing itself as exactly the formidable opponent he had expected: brutally hot during the day, surprisingly cold at night, and constantly demanding navigation skills and resource management that tested every aspect of his preparation. On the 4th day of the race, however, the Sahara decided to remind all the competitors exactly who was in control. Weather conditions that had been challenging but manageable suddenly deteriorated into something far more dangerous: a massive sandstorm that would transform Mauro's adventure race into a life-or-death survival ordeal that would test limits he never knew existed. The sandstorm that engulfed the Marathon des Sables on April 13, 1994, was the kind of meteorological event that transforms familiar terrain into an alien landscape and reduces human technology to uselessness within minutes. Mauro Prosperi was running strongly through the fourth stage of the race, when the horizon ahead of him simply disappeared behind a wall of sand and wind that rose hundreds of feet into the sky. Veteran desert runners know that sandstorms in the Sahara can be deadly for reasons that go far beyond visibility problems. The winds can reach speeds of over 60 miles per hour, carrying sand particles that strip skin and clog breathing passages. Temperatures can fluctuate wildly as the storm system passes through, and the electromagnetic properties of millions of airborne sand particles can interfere with navigation equipment and radio communications. Mauro's initial response to the approaching storm was exactly what his training and experience suggested. He stopped running, found what shelter he could behind a large rock formation, and prepared to wait out the worst of the weather. Marathon des Sables competitors were equipped with emergency beacons and had been trained in storm survival procedures. But nothing in the race briefings had prepared them for the sheer scale and duration of what was approaching. The storm lasted for 8 hours, turning day into night and creating a world where visibility dropped to less than 3 feet. The sound was like standing inside a jet engine, making communication impossible and disorienting competitors who tried to move during the worst of the conditions. Sand penetrated every piece of equipment, every article of clothing, and every opening in the human body, creating a misery that went beyond anything most of the athletes had ever experienced. When the storm finally passed and Mauro emerged from his improvised shelter, he found himself in a landscape that looked nothing like the terrain he remembered from earlier in the race. The familiar landmarks he had been using for navigation were either buried under new sand formations or completely obscured by the changed topography. His compass was functioning, but the GPS technology available in 1994 was not reliable enough for precise navigation in such remote areas. More critically, Mauro had become separated from the other competitors during the storm. The Marathon des Sables route was marked by flags and checkpoints, but the storm had either buried or blown away many of these navigation aids. He was alone in one of the world's most hostile environments with limited food and water, no reliable means of communication, and navigation equipment that seemed increasingly useless in the transformed landscape. His decision to continue moving, rather than staying in place and waiting for rescue, was based on his athlete's mindset and his confidence in his navigation abilities. Mauro believed he could find his way back to the race route by heading in what he calculated to be the correct direction, using his compass and his memory of the pre-storm terrain to guide him back to safety. What Mauro didn't know was that the sandstorm had blown him nearly 180 miles off course, carrying him deep into a region of the Sahara where no human settlements existed and where the landscape consisted of endless expanses of sand dunes, rocky plateaus, and scattered oases that might be separated by days of walking. He was no longer lost within a few miles of the race route. He was lost in one of the most remote and dangerous regions on Earth. For the first 24 hours after the storm, Mauro maintained his athlete's optimism and systematic approach to problem solving. He rationed his water carefully, maintained a steady walking pace in what he believed to be the correct direction, and expected to encounter either race officials or other competitors within hours. His physical conditioning was excellent. His equipment was functioning properly, and his mental state remained focused and determined. But as the first day stretched into the second day without any sign of the race route or human presence, Mauro began to understand that his situation was far more serious than a simple navigation error. He was truly lost in the Sahara Desert, with water supplies that would last perhaps 2 more days and food that might sustain him for less than a week. The confident athlete who had entered the storm was beginning to transform into something else entirely, a human being fighting for survival in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. What do you think was going through Mauro's mind when he realized he wasn't just temporarily lost, but potentially facing death in one of the world's most hostile environments. Let me know in the comments how you think you would react to discovering you were completely alone in the Sahara Desert. By the third day of wandering through the trackless Sahara, Mauro Prosperi had consumed the last of his water and was beginning to experience the early stages of severe dehydration. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his tongue felt swollen and foreign in his mouth, and his urine had become dark and scanty, clear signs that his body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions to preserve vital organs. The heat during the day was becoming unbearable, with ground temperatures reaching levels that could literally cook human flesh. Mauro had learned to walk only during the cooler hours of dawn and dusk, spending the blazing midday hours seeking whatever shade he could find among the scattered rock formations that dotted the endless sand. But shade in the Sahara provides only marginal relief when ambient temperatures exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. It was during one of these desperate searches for daytime shelter that Mauro discovered what would become both his salvation and his personal house of horrors, an abandoned Islamic shrine, or marabout, that had been built around a natural cave formation in a rocky outcrop. The structure was ancient, weathered by centuries of desert storms, but it offered something that was becoming more valuable than gold: shade, shelter, and protection from the killing heat of the Sahara sun. The shrine had clearly been abandoned for decades, possibly centuries. Sand had drifted into the corners, and the decorative elements that once marked it as a holy place had been worn away by wind and time. But for Mauro, it represented the difference between life and death, a place where he could survive the daylight hours and begin to think systematically about his situation rather than simply enduring it. Thank you so much for staying with us this far. Your engagement means everything to us, and I promise you, the most incredible part of this story is still to come. As Mauro explored his refuge more thoroughly, he made a discovery that would define the next phase of his survival ordeal. The ceiling of the shrine was inhabited by a colony of bats, desert species that had adapted to the harsh environment and had made the abandoned structure their roosting place. For most people, the presence of bats would have been merely an unpleasant addition to an already desperate situation. For Mauro, they represented the difference between death from dehydration and the possibility of continued survival. The decision to hunt and kill the bats was not made lightly. Mauro understood that he was crossing a psychological threshold that would forever change his relationship with civilized behavior and normal human dietary constraints. But dehydration was affecting his cognitive function, and his body was beginning to consume its own muscle tissue for energy. The bats represented protein and, more critically, fluid that could keep him alive for additional days. Catching the bats required ingenuity and patience that tested Mauro's athletic coordination and hunting instincts. Using improvised tools and techniques that drew on his police training and athletic problem-solving skills, he managed to capture several of the creatures. What followed was even more challenging psychologically. The decision to drink their blood while it was still warm, knowing that this fluid represented his only reliable source of hydration. The taste and texture of bat blood was everything that Mauro's civilized mind rebelled against. But his survival instincts overrode years of cultural conditioning and personal revulsion. He later described the experience as transformative, not just physically, but psychologically. He was no longer Mauro Prosperi, the Olympic athlete or the Italian police officer. He had become something more primitive, a predator whose only goal was surviving until the next day. The shrine became Mauro's base of operations for what would become a week-long ordeal of extreme survival. During the day, he sheltered from the killing heat and planned his hunting activities. At night, when the bats were active, he would attempt to catch them using techniques that became more sophisticated as his desperation grew. He rationed the blood and flesh carefully, understanding that these might be his only sources of nutrition for an indefinite period. But perhaps more challenging than the physical aspects of his situation was the psychological impact of complete isolation in an environment that seemed designed to kill him. Mauro began talking to himself, having conversations with family members who existed only in his imagination, and sometimes losing track of time and place in ways that suggested his mind was beginning to protect itself from the full reality of his situation. The shrine that had seemed like salvation was becoming a prison where Mauro was slowly losing his grip on the civilized identity he had spent his entire life building. He was surviving, but at a cost that went far deeper than physical discomfort. He was discovering aspects of human nature that most people never have to confront. On the 6th day of his ordeal, Mauro Prosperi reached a psychological breaking point that transformed his survival story into something far darker and more complex. He had been surviving on bat blood, his own urine, and the occasional moisture he could extract from his own clothing, but his body was beginning to fail in ways that no amount of determination could overcome. The physical deterioration was becoming catastrophic. Mauro had lost over 35 pounds, reducing his weight to a skeletal 99 pounds that left him looking like a concentration camp survivor. His skin had taken on the leathery texture of severe dehydration, his eyes had sunk deep into their sockets, and his muscles had wasted away to the point where simple movements required enormous effort. More critically, his mental state was deteriorating as dehydration affected his brain function. But it was the psychological torment that finally broke him. The isolation, the constant fear, the degradation of hunting bats and drinking their blood, and the growing certainty that he would never see his family again, combined to create a despair so profound that death began to seem like mercy rather than defeat. Mauro later described this moment as the complete collapse of everything that had defined his identity. He was no longer an athlete, a police officer, a husband, or a father. He was simply a dying animal in a cave, and he wanted the suffering to end. The decision to attempt suicide was made with the same methodical approach that Mauro had applied to his athletic training and police work. He had a safety razor in his survival kit, and he understood enough about human anatomy to know where to make cuts that would be effective. His plan was to slit his wrists and allow himself to bleed to death rather than continue the slow agony of starvation and dehydration in the abandoned shrine. What happened next became one of the most ironically life-saving moments in survival history. When Mauro made the cuts on his wrists, expecting to watch his life drain away in the sand, he discovered that his blood was so thick from dehydration that it immediately clotted and stopped flowing. His body was so depleted of fluids that it couldn't even bleed properly. The very dehydration that was killing him had also made suicide impossible. The failed suicide attempt created a psychological shock that paradoxically restored Mauro's will to live. Lying in the shrine with self-inflicted wounds that had refused to kill him, he experienced what he later described as a moment of clarity that cut through the despair and hopelessness that had overwhelmed him. If his body was refusing to die even when he wanted it to, perhaps he was meant to continue fighting for survival. This moment of renewed determination coincided with a critical decision about his survival strategy. Instead of remaining a shrine and waiting for rescue that might never come, Mauro decided to leave his shelter and attempt to walk to safety, even though he had no reliable information about which direction might lead to human habitation. It was a choice between certain slow death in the cave and possible death, while actively fighting for survival. The psychological transformation that followed the failed suicide attempt was as dramatic as his physical deterioration had been. Mauro began to see his ordeal not as a random disaster but as a test of his fundamental character, a challenge that would either destroy him completely or reveal reserves of strength and determination that he had never known he possessed. He began preparing for what he understood might be his final journey out of the shrine. His supplies were almost exhausted. His physical condition was approaching the limits of human endurance, and he had no navigation equipment that could guarantee he was walking towards safety, rather than deeper into the desert. But for the first time in days, he felt something resembling hope. Not hope for easy rescue, but hope that he might die fighting rather than surrendering to despair. The man who prepared to leave the shrine was fundamentally different from the confident athlete who had entered the Marathon des Sables days earlier. Mauro had been stripped down to the most basic elements of human survival, the simple determination to continue existing for one more day, one more hour, one more step across the endless sand. On the morning of his 9th day in the Sahara, Mauro Prosperi began what he believed would be his final journey across the desert. His physical condition was so deteriorated that walking required conscious effort for each step, and his mental state alternated between periods of clarity and hallucinatory episodes brought on by severe dehydration and malnutrition. He had no reliable sense of direction and no realistic hope of finding civilization. But he was determined to die moving toward life, rather than waiting for death in the abandoned shrine. The landscape that Mauro encountered as he left his shelter was even more hostile than the terrain he had crossed during his first days of being lost. The endless sand dunes stretched to every horizon, broken only by scattered rock formations that offered no shade and no indication of which direction might lead to safety. The heat was becoming unbearable even during the early morning hours, and Mauro understood that he had perhaps hours rather than days before his body would simply stop functioning. But the psychological transformation that had followed his failed suicide attempt continued to sustain him through conditions that should have been impossible to endure. Instead of the athlete's goal-oriented mindset that had initially guided his survival efforts, Mauro had developed something more fundamental, a simple determination to continue existing that didn't depend on hope for rescue or realistic assessment of his chances. The hallucinations that began during his final day of walking were both terrifying and oddly comforting. Mauro later described conversations with his wife and children who seemed to be walking beside him, offering encouragement and guidance that felt completely real despite his rational understanding that he was alone. These episodes suggested that his brain was protecting itself from the full reality of his situation by creating companions and hope where none existed. It was during one of these hallucinatory episodes that Mauro first saw what he initially believed to be another mirage, a group of figures moving across the sand in the distance. His experience of the previous days had taught him that the desert played tricks with vision and perception, creating images of water, vegetation, and human presence where none existed. But as he forced himself to focus on the distant figures, they began to resolve into something that his dehydrated brain could barely process: actual human beings moving purposefully across the landscape. The Tuareg nomads who found Mauro later described their shock at encountering what appeared to be a walking skeleton in the middle of one of the Sahara's most remote regions. His appearance was so dramatically altered by weight loss and dehydration that they initially weren't certain he was human. His skin had turned dark and leathery from sun exposure, his eyes were deeply sunken, and his movements had the mechanical quality of someone whose body was operating on pure determination rather than normal physiological function. The rescue itself was as much a cultural encounter as a life-saving intervention. The Tuareg nomads who found Mauro were part of a traditional desert people who had been traveling the Sahara for generations, possessing knowledge of desert survival that had been passed down through centuries of harsh living. Their immediate assessment of Mauro's condition was both more accurate and more hopeful than any modern medical evaluation might have been. The nomads' approach to treating severe dehydration was based on traditional methods that prioritized gradual rehydration and careful monitoring of the patient's response to fluids. They understood that giving too much water too quickly to someone in Mauro's condition could be as dangerous as continued dehydration, and their treatment followed protocols that had been developed through generations of desert experience. The journey back to civilization took 2 days, with Mauro traveling on camelback while the nomads monitored his condition and continued his rehydration process. During this time, he began to understand the full extent of his ordeal. He had been lost for 9 days, had wandered nearly 200 miles from the race route, and had survived in conditions that should have killed him within the first 72 hours. When Mauro finally reached medical facilities and was able to contact his family, the emotional impact of his survival was as overwhelming as the physical recovery process. His wife and children had been told that he was missing and presumed dead, and the Marathon des Sables organization had suspended search efforts after several days of unsuccessful attempts to locate him. His reappearance was treated as a resurrection rather than a rescue. The medical assessment of Mauro's condition revealed the extraordinary physiological adaptations his body had made during the survival ordeal. Despite losing over 30% of his body weight, he had avoided the organ failure and brain damage that typically occur in such extreme dehydration cases. His survival had required not just mental determination but also unusual physical resilience, that allowed his body to function at the very limits of human endurance. So what do you think gave Mauro Prosperi the strength to survive 9 days in hell, drinking bat blood in his own urine to stay alive? Was it his Olympic athlete's conditioning, his police officer's mental toughness, or something deeper? A primal survival instinct that emerges when civilization disappears and death becomes the only alternative to fighting? Could you have made the choice to drink bat blood, knowing it was your only chance to live another day? This story challenges every assumption about the limits of human endurance and the depths to which we might sink to preserve our own lives. Mauro's ordeal in the Sahara stripped away every aspect of his civilized identity and revealed something more fundamental: the basic determination to continue existing that lies beneath all our social roles and personal achievements. Let us know in the comments what aspect of Mauro's survival story affected you most. Was it his transformation from elite athlete to desert predator? His failed suicide attempt that paradoxically saved his life? Or his complete psychological rebirth after being rescued? How far would you go to survive if civilization disappeared and only your determination stood between you and death? If this incredible story of survival against impossible odds fascinated you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most extreme true stories of human endurance, survival, and then the moments that reveal who we really are when everything familiar disappears. And don't miss our next video, where we'll explore another story that pushes the boundaries of human survival. The tale of a family that survived a plane crash in the Amazon rainforest and had to fight their way through one of the world's most dangerous ecosystems to reach safety. Trust us, you won't want to miss it. Until next time, remember that the human capacity for survival goes far beyond what we imagine possible, and that sometimes our darkest moments become the foundation for discovering strength we never knew we possessed.